it almost always begins with somebody referring me to that person. So that person would have heard about me in some way. They'll reach out with an email and say, hey, can we talk? They will typically have looked at me online, as I've learned is pretty much the case with most sales. I've been shopped, so to speak. So they might have looked at me on the website, they might have seen me on LinkedIn, they know something about my work, and they have some reference that they trust. And then we have a conversation. I will typically test to see, do they even have any federal sales? If somebody doesn't have any federal sales, they're not ready for me yet. I need to work with companies who are in the system and now ready to evolve within the system, because those initial barriers to entry are not where I specialize. I help move people more quickly, but you have to be started. And we will typically talk through what is it that the company thinks they're struggling with. There's usually some objective that is problematic. They see competitors outpacing them, or they fall just below a cut line of what they expected was going to be good news, or they recognize that they don't have information that allows them to answer some basic questions I might ask about their program, about their funding, about the policy that supports their funding. And so there's some exploration that takes place. But we have to get to a point where they understand that I know what I'm talking about and that I may have answers and be able to guide them in ways and down pathways that they haven't seen before. And usually that recognition comes fairly quickly. When that happens, I can then convert our conversation into a simple proposal that might be 2 pages in length that would describe, hey, this is what I think we can do, and this is how we would do it, and this is the timeline in which it would take place. And then we can have a discussion about whether they want to move forward or not. That can take 1 phone call, 2 conference calls. It could take 3 months. It depends on the company and how mature they are in the process. But the funny thing about it is that the same process works for all companies. Doesn't matter if you're a small company or a very large company. Doesn't matter if it's solely US based or an international company. The government process is the same. And what people are typically looking for is some way to better navigate that process, to move more quickly, and to get to outcomes faster. Companies that need me typically don't have a Washington presence. They recognize that something's happening in Washington, and they may get to Washington periodically, either to meet with their customer or to participate in supplier days. But sometimes it's in those Washington visits where they begin to recognize that there are things that they don't understand or relationships that they don't have. A company that has a full-up Washington operation typically doesn't need me because they have in-house support. Now, there are companies with small and lean Washington operations that do use me, but more often than not, and there are hundreds of thousands of these sort of companies I'm about to describe, a company that's outside the Beltway bubble that doesn't have direct exposure or regular exposure to the decision-making apparatus or to the people, they are typically the ones that I can provide the most support for. So at a certain size, and it's typically around $1 billion in revenue, a company will recognize that they need people in Washington full-time. And that's for a couple of reasons. All the big decision makers are in Washington. There are agencies around the country, certainly, and in DoD there are distributed activities, but the major decisions are made in Washington, D.C. There are people who specialize in congressional-facing work or executive branch-facing work, and at a certain size, it makes sense to have full-time people facing in each of those directions. Sometimes at specific customers. Sometimes it's by a specific program. So there may be a congressional-facing person and a program manager-facing person in a company. So you might have 2 people doing that job. Smaller companies don't have the bandwidth they don't have the headcount to support that sort of a presence. So they might not make that investment. And it doesn't make sense for them to. They can hire that. They can hire somebody like me to be that presence for them, and I can be there when I need to be there to help them move through the process. This is a difficult process to learn, and it does take time to learn it. You can accelerate your learning by reading about it. I've written several books on the subject. They're publicly available on Amazon at a minimum. Some are available through my website. Those have been my effort to offer something to companies who are not quite ready for me. I have an online program called Capital Currency that is ideally suited for a company that thinks they might need help, but they don't quite know what kind of help they need. And it's an immersive program where they can go through a guidebook, go through templates filled with questions that government customers ask. There are videos that are instructional and offer specific examples of how to have various types of communications in the Washington environment. But that's an easy way and a low-cost way to learn how this process works, and then to make their own decision about how much additional focus do they want to put on this. You can ride along and react to requests for proposal for a long, long time, and you can succeed to a degree. But if you really want to excel in federal sales, you need to learn how to shape those sort of outcomes long before the RFP phase. So to take the time to go to the Hill requires one to step back a little bit and sort of sketch out what is it that we're trying to achieve. So in any case, there are objectives that need to be identified. Is there a policy that's inhibiting a federal sale? Is there funding that needs to be positioned to support a federal sale? In order to explain that situation to decision makers, the story needs to be developed. And many companies struggle with their story because they haven't really thought it through from the position of their audience, whether it's in Congress or in the executive branch. They just tell what they know, and they come in a fairly unorganized way. It's difficult for people to admit that their egos are getting in the way, but because they don't have a tight message, they're not ready to have those conversations. Long before Matt and I go to the Hill, we have orchestrated a message. We spend a lot of time on that message. We make sure that it's tight and that we understand how it will be told, and that it makes sense for the government customer, it makes sense for Congress, and it makes sense for solving a problem of the government. When you can tell a tight story at the right place and time in front of the right audiences, it's very easy for those decision makers to make the right decision and agree with you. And it's often the case that the government customer is doing something more slowly than they should, or in a way that's costing more than it needs to. And when you can present an alternative that's logical, that fits, it's easy for them to say yes. You know, I tell companies when we start out that I don't work to a long-term contract. Every one of my arrangements is monthly. I work on a monthly retainer. And that retainer is determined by the type of work that we're pursuing. And so I use the term objective a lot. We agree to the objective that we're trying to achieve. I have clients who've been with me 10 years on a month-to-month basis with a handshake. I don't have any long-term contracts. I have some proposals that were a formalization of what our initial phone calls were about, but nearly all clients recognize that you can't capture everything in a written document and that the relationship changes. The situation might change, but more often what changes is the client's recognition of what I can do for them. And so the work may start out pursuing a particular objective for a particular customer, and we may recognize that there are internal issues to the company that should be addressed. Sometimes there are strategy issues that are not being addressed. Sometimes there are additional customers that are in an adjacency to the original customer. Could be another Navy customer, for example. Could be another Army customer. So sometimes the work morphs into another opportunity that comes about. A client can stay with me for years, but I say that, hey, when we start out, we're not getting married here. So you have an out, and your out is you can leave on 30 days notice, and so can I. So if you start to abuse me as a service provider, I can say, hey, this isn't working out. That's pretty rare. If for some reason you think that I'm not delivering, you can say, I've had enough, and in 30 days we're done. That's pretty rare. And so what really happens with the 30-day out is that I lose a client when there's an acquisition and then a competitive situation develops. So say one client buys another, and now I have an issue with a competitor of that third party. That becomes problematic, and I have to say I need to step back. There are companies who will serve multiple masters in the same very specific areas, and I just think that's unethical, and I don't do that. There's no shortage of people who are willing to take a client's money in exchange for some sort of consulting service. I don't do that. We are pretty clear about what the objectives are, and we have open discussion when it's time to transition to something else, or if the work is complete. There are times when it's a specific policy pursuit that a company is in search of, and the policy is achieved, the law gets changed, and the issue is resolved, and then the work is done. We have to acknowledge that and move on. When they come into the arrangement, I want them to know that they're making an investment here that is going to produce a return unlike anything else that they're investing in their company. And that typically translates to something that looks like 20 to 100 times the investment. That is not hyperbole. We work in big numbers. I'm not allowed to take a percentage of the deal. So if somebody makes a $1 billion sale to the federal government, and that happens, I don't get a percentage of $1 billion. That's against the law. In business development, you're allowed to take a percentage of the back end of a success. In lobbying, that's referred to as a success fee, and that's illegal. So I can't do that, and I don't do that. So I have a much more measured retainer fee that is therefore much more agreeable to a client, such that the return that I'm promising, I can deliver. And if you can show me something else where you're investing and you're getting 20 to 100 times the return, you would be the first to ever show me that. I do calculate it as companies progress. What have we done year over year? But I don't hold that up as a scorecard. There are things about the process that I can't control, that nobody can control. And unfortunately, there are people who will promise an outcome sometimes. I can't promise an outcome. I can promise you a seat at the table and that you fully participate in the process. And I have a track record over time that shows that most of the time that works out pretty darn well. There are times when it doesn't, and companies have a decision to make. Do we try this again, or do we stop? It's much more common for companies to participate and try again, knowing that 2 out of 3 years isn't bad. But to go year over year over year for 10 years, I have had clients do that. That is a high expectation. But it depends on what you sell. It depends what the government interest in that item is or that service. And no two situations are exactly alike. Sometimes when I speak publicly, I'll use some examples. I try to protect the clients so that they don't. It doesn't look so blatant that they're working the system, so to speak. But we're all working the system. That's what sales is how do you influence a process. We are selling to the government, and so we are trying to influence outcomes, and it's for the greater good. It's for national security. It's for the good of the company's profitability and for shareholder value. So there are legitimate reasons to be pursuing this in the first place. I mentioned that some companies are pursuing funding outcomes. So I represent shipbuilders, where we try to get the government to change their decision policy on what priority of ship might the government spend on. There are times when the Navy will come forward, for example, and say, hey, we only need one of these this year, because they know Congress will add a second one. There's a balance in this government buying process. It's a little peculiar, but for those that understand it, they can understand how to maneuver within it. Some are not selling ships or airplanes, they're selling components of some of those bigger systems. And sometimes components get lost in the mix. Sometimes there are unique things about an industry or a segment of an industry that Congress or the buying customer may not know, and we try to help highlight why that may be important. So there can be a constituent reason, there can be an industrial-based reason, there may be a reason to buy from more than one vendor. So I'm describing a variety of different circumstances that could fit. My clients are typically pursuing some movement of money that will eventually come to them, that they will be willing to compete for and prepared to compete for, but it will come to them faster. That could be 10 million in a year, it could be 100 million in a year. Those numbers are quite attainable depending on what the product is.